Hi, welcome back to the second part of the current issues revolving around unemployment. Here we are talking about the issues which are related to unemployment, is a consequence of unemployment or causes unemployment. My name is Susan Wanjiku. I'm the founder of Wanjiku's Eye, and here I discuss the relationship between economic development and governance so that you can understand, engage and influence the matters that affect you and I. Welcome to Wanjiku's Eye. Now, let's get right into it. Now, I begin this episode with HELB. So, for those who don't know what HELB is a loan facility for students who want to pursue higher education, especially for those who come from very needy backgrounds. And this fund is managed by the Higher Education Loans Board, HELB. So, it's a state agency under the Ministry of Education. Now, these student loans were designed to be a revolving fund, meaning that students get funded to go to university or TVET institutions, and the beneficiaries are expected to pay back this loan with interest a year after graduation. This is regardless of whether or not you get a job. And if you default, there are penalties. Now here is where the problem comes in. Remember I said it's a revolving fund, so as the loans are being paid back, that is also what is used to fund other students. So just add 2 and 2. So if the students who have received the loans are unable to pay back the loan, that means that in the future, there are some students who will need the money and will not be able to get it. Now, this isn't a hypothetical situation. We're already facing this dilemma in Kenya. Now, in February of 2023, it was reported that 140,000 students missed out on HELB loans because there was no money. Then a year ago in 2022, this number was 75,000. So you can see it's been increasing. Then in 2019, the number of defaults of the loan was at 78,328. Then by 2021, the number of defaults had increased to 116,642. Now, to encourage people to pay back the loans, the government of Uhuru Kenyatta gave a waiver, 100% waiver on the penalties, which reduced the account defaults by 50,000. The number of defaults then reduced from 109,000 in February of 2022 to 94,000 account defaults in August 2022. So Parliament at some point even attempted to slash the interest rate from 4% to 3% to reduce the burden on the students, but HELB pushed back and said that if the interest rate was even reduced by just 1%, 18,730 students will miss out on the loans. So I believe HELB would be more sustainable if the economic conditions in the country were different and unemployment wasn't such a big problem. So I spoke about the unemployment of doctors and teachers in my previous episode and even gave you some statistics. Some of these unemployed teachers and doctors are beneficiaries of HELB, but for these two professions, they're just one of the many examples of professionals who can't pay off their loans due to unemployment. And just based off of this situation, what does the future look like? I told you that HELB is one of the government interventions to ensure that people get skills at a higher level, especially if they can't afford it. So being unable to afford tertiary education is one of the greatest barriers to acquiring these skills. So if they can't fund themselves and they can't access HELB loans, unless a miracle happens, we can say that generally speaking, unemployment in the future is going to persist. I know that the government is working on a new kind of HELB called the National Skill and Funding Council, whose model is apparently less complicated. But I say for as long as it's a loan and people can't get the job so that they can be able to pay back the loans, that fund will equally run into similar problems. And this is especially going to be the case if the government doesn't fix the underlying issues of the economy. And that takes me to the appointment of principal secretaries, chief administrative secretaries, and cabinet secretaries. Now, in episode 6, I spoke about how unemployment affects politics and the quality of your government. And I took you through the choices that because the private sector has become quite unpredictable and hostile and expensive to do business and hard to get employment, then in such an environment, getting employed in government becomes the safest option. Why? Because the possibility of losing your job when you work in government is very low. So even if your salary is delayed, you will be paid eventually. Unlike in the private sector where employers can even ghost you sometimes. Now, in most cases, if you're employed in government agencies, ministries and parastatals, your job is safe. Now, this year we had people being nominated and vetted and appointed to position of Principal Secretary, Chief Administrative Secretary and Cabinet Secretary. Now, in an ideal situation, you want professionals in those jobs because these are people heading entire industries, not just a small business. So ministries provide the strategy and plan for how our country needs to move forward with certain goals in mind in different sectors. So ministries also work in cohesion. They work together because they are interconnected and they influence one another. So for example, the Ministry of Roads and Transport and the Ministry of Industry and Trade need one another because a good transport network facilitates business and it also comes with other benefits. So in an ideal situation, you don't want people who are carried away by the drama of Kenyan politics. Anyway, Kenya is not an ideal country. So instead, the people who were selected this year were former governors and MPs, people who lost elections, and people who are just, well, connected politically. Or politically, individuals who are affiliated to politicians, not people with integrity and character and the skills and experience required to head an entire industry. Instead, the people who are selected this year were either former governors and MPs, people who lost in the elections, and well-connected, politically affiliated individuals and loyalists. Now, if these people had proper experience and skills and had integrity, it would be a different story, we'd accept them. But a majority of them barely have that combination, and these are people who are responsible for heading entire industries. Now remember, the president himself was venting about how some ministers in Kenya, here in Kenya, ministers are cabinet secretaries, and also principal secretaries don't understand what their job entails. Now, the government has tried to reinstitute the chief administrative secretary position despite the court ruling. I did a video on why the CAS position was declared unconstitutional, and part of the reason is that it will have implications on the budget of our country and our finances. And since the government keeps complaining about how the previous government messed up our finances as a country, it's only reasonable and prudent that we live within our means as part of rebuilding our country if they're actually serious about rebuilding. Because this isn't the time to start overburdening Kenyans with taxes to finance an extravagant government. I honestly don't think ministries are going to collapse without the presence of the CASs. Anyway, what does that have to do with unemployment? Number one, government and politics in Kenya and worldwide is very messy. And to be very honest, running a country is no easy task. So for most people holding political seats and senior government positions, once their time is over, they move on to other things outside of government. They don't cling onto government unless they are an African politician or connected to one. But they do this because they know that they need to stay in government, because doing legitimate business in this country or finding another job in the private sector is difficult. Well, unless you're Polycarp Igathe, that's the reality of most Kenyans. Because vitu kwa ground ni difficult. So politicians would rather do anything in their power to have the security of being employed in government than to go back and work hard in the private sector like every other Kenyan. But what did I tell you? Bad governance, underperforming economy, and more unemployment. Or siasa mbaya, maisha mbaya. There are characters who should not be in government because they are making some of the most important decisions for the country, literally crafting your future and the future of the country. And guys, I keep telling you, fixing an economy is no joke. And this brings me to Hekaya za Linturi and other maize growing stories. Now, before I proceed with this story, let me give a disclaimer that I don't know if the government still intends to proceed with this intervention, because the government has been very silent on this, but let me just use it as an example to show what such an intervention could have on the state of employment in this country. Now, our Minister of Agriculture, Mithika Linturi, in April 2023, said that the Ministry of Agriculture intends to contract farmers in Zambia to produce maize exclusively for this Kenyan market. His justification for this intervention is that it's much cheaper to produce maize in Zambia than in Kenya. Now, just to add some context for the people outside Kenya, maize is a staple food in Kenya, and it's the main input used to produce unga or maize flour. So at the time Mithika Linturi said this, the price of unga was very high, and it was becoming a political issue. Now, first of all, it's ironical that the country that they intend to grow maize in is also importing maize to cover their own shortage. That was at the time. So they were also experiencing a shortage, which was also happening in many other parts of the world. Nonetheless, I have repeatedly stated on my channel that one thing that makes the Kenyan economy tough for business is the cost of doing business. It's very expensive, and the high cost of doing business is also partly responsible for the high unemployment in Kenya. Remember, a high cost of doing business is also caused by many factors at a time. So we want to run away from our problems here, and instead of fixing the causes that lead to a high cost of doing business, which affects all businesses, not just maize production, we'd rather look the other way and pretend that those problems don't exist. And instead we opt for band-aid solutions. But at the same time, it's quite mind-boggling that it doesn't need an economist to see that such a decision would affect everyone in the value chain of maize production. I don't think that Kenyans are particularly patriotic when it comes to looking for a good deal, because many people are struggling. So if the maize produced in Kenya can't compete with the price of the Zambian maize, that puts the maize farmers out of business. Now one would argue, can the farmers just farm something else? Maybe they can, but consider this. Yes, farmers can transition into producing something else, but what happens when maize production in Zambia fails, or Zambia refuses to export the maize, or logistics issues, or they're just unable to for whatever reason? Because remember, COVID showed us many things. So we end up being exposed to many risks, like first of all, food security issues, an increase in food prices, and diplomatic and political risks. But that's not what I'm talking about today. Anyway, the court temporarily stopped the government's plan to contract the Zambian farmers, but things might change by the time this video is published. But anyway, the bottom line is this move could put many people out of business, and as a result, people lose their jobs and their livelihoods. So if you interfere with the maize farmers, you're interfering with those that are employed or self-employed in that maize value chain. Also, the excuse that it's cheaper to produce in another country is going to set a precedent, and instead of fixing our problems and making it possible to produce here, we'll be forever running to import things. But what will we be doing while doing that? We'll be killing local businesses, and people are going to lose their jobs. So some of these issues are man-made problems. And guys, please, this is not the time for textbook economics. And most times we know that there's someone somewhere exploiting these dynamics, these man-made problems. Then finally, with unemployment, you end up exposing your country to political instability, ticking time bombs, and an opportunity for opportunists. For example, in 2010, there were a series of anti-government protests called the Arab Spring. It began with Tunisia and spread to some countries in the Middle East and North Africa, like Libya, Yemen, Syria, Bahrain. Yeah. Then in 2022, we saw that in South Africa, what began as a protest demanding the release of a former president who was jailed for corruption, things took an ugly turn, which turned into looting of businesses, vandalism, and other businesses were burned down. And this, I think, lasted for a week or two. So opportunists took over. Then we also saw other protests in Nigeria and Tunisia at the time. Then in Kenya in 2023, we had maandamano Mondays and Tuesdays, and that was about to spiral out of control, and some property was damaged because people were pissed off about the economic conditions of the country. But anyway, for all these countries, even though the revolutions played out differently at different times, the underlying issues for the revolutions were similar. For example, economic mismanagement that can never lack, governments that are not accountable to the people, massive plundering of public resources, and government institutions full of cronyism, nepotism, and all the other aims. All the while there's high unemployment, many people living in poverty, very big gap between the rich and the poor, and so much unfairness in society. So the consequence of all this is that people end up without economic freedom. So if you don't have economic freedom, life makes choices for you. Go watch my video on the social cost of unemployment. And here is the thing. A bad economy causes high unemployment, and high unemployment makes the country politically volatile, and there's political instability, which then in turn discourages business activity, which leads to more unemployment. So guys, desperate people can be very dangerous people. It's the reason why when I began, I said high unemployment is a nightmare for any responsible government, because it puts a country on a downward spiral. But to conclude, I see that it's like the government is intentionally trying to shoot themselves in the foot by making it harder to do business, by making tax and administrative compliance even more difficult, introducing new statutory deductions from the salaries of employees, taxes. Anyway, I believe this brings me to the end of the unemployment series. So just in case I have something else to add, guys, I will do so. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching and for staying around through this 10 episodes. I hope you have enjoyed this series. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Make sure you share it within your circles, like it, and most importantly, don't forget to subscribe. Happy New Year officially. I know by the time this video goes up, it will be 2024. So anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. As always, I will see you in the next one. Cheers.